All right, so I'm going to talk about Stephen King's book, The Gunslinger, which is the first in the Dark Tower series, and specifically how this ties to the Arthurian legend, the Arthurian mythos. So I haven't read the rest of the series, so I don't know where it's going. So this is just my observations based off of book one, and this will be a spoiler discussion because I'm talking about the parallels or the things I noticed in this that would link it to the Arthurian legend. And also, I'm going to be talking about the inversion of symbols. So how Stephen King takes symbols and then turns them upside down. He inverts them. So, first of all, one of the major things that I noticed. So let's just talk about this right off the bat. We have a gunslinger. Our name character in the novel, and I guess throughout the series, is going to be Roland Duchesne. When we first get introduced to him, he's just the gunslinger. We don't know his name. We find out his name in the second half of the book. And he is pursuing a man in black across the wasteland in this novel, looking for the Dark Tower. Okay, so the Dark Tower is going to play prominently throughout the series. The series is named The Dark Tower. But what is it? This is one of the things I first noticed was on page 84 of this book. All right, it talks about the Dark Tower, and it specifically says or makes a direct comparison to the Grail. So it says here, page 84, there was murder, there was rape, there were unspeakable practices, and all of them were for the good, the bloody myth, for the Grail, for the tower. Ah, the tower stood somewhere in the middle of things, so they did say, rearing its black-gray bulk to the sky. And in his desert-scoured ears, the gunslinger heard the faint, sweet sound of his mother's voice. That's not important, but the connection to the Grail is there. So what is the Grail? You know, people today, they might not know what the Holy Grail is. If you've seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Holy Grail, or Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail, that's probably people's best point of reference to it. The Holy Grail was the cup in legend that was used at the Last Supper by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper, and then caught his blood at the crucifixion. Okay, that really, we could go through all these various Grail myths. We could talk about Corinthian, we could talk about the Vulgate cycle and all that, but really the probably this is the one that fleshed it out the most. It gave the Grail its backstory. Okay, because this is the text that specifically connects it to Joseph of Arimathea in the Bible. All right, but in Robert de Boron, I think this was 1204, I think is when this was published, written. The cup of the Last Supper. Okay, Joseph of Arimathea, who was there to remove Jesus along with Nicodemus from the cross, caught the blood of Christ in the chalice in Robert de Boron, and brings the cup back to England, to Glastonbury, England, and founds the first Christian, church there, the first Christian community. So, of course, the Knights of the Round Table, they quest for the cup, and then that's kind of the undoing of the Knights of the Round Table. You have Percival questing for it in the early Arthurian tales. When you're looking at Corinthian, when you're looking at Robert de Boron, when you're looking at Wolfram von Eschenbach. In fact, they did a whole read of this, and there's chapter summaries for this book that I did in a playlist. It's Parzival. And then when you get into the Vulgate cycle, okay, like here, it ends up becoming Galahad. And then in La Morte de Tor, it's Galahad. Okay, the quest for the cup. But the important thing is this link to the Dark Tower. Because in Robert de Boron, he says that there was the Last Supper, okay, that the table that the 12 disciples and Jesus sat at was a round table. And then in his book here, he says Joseph of Arimathea built a round table. And then Arthur builds a round table. And at the center of this round table is the Holy Grail. All right? Now, thinking about that, what is it? Well, in terms of a table being round, a circle, right? A circle has no beginning and no end. So it kind of represents the cosmos. And at the center of this table is the cup of Christ, the chalice, the grail. Okay, so you can kind of see the parallel here, because at the end of the Gunslinger, all right, we learned that the actual Dark Tower is like the nexus point for the multiverse, for all of the universe, for all of the worlds known and unknown. It sits at the center and kind of holds everything together. So this is what the man in black tells us. Suppose that all worlds, all universes met in a single nexus, a single pylon, a tower, and within it a stairway, perhaps rising to the Godhead itself. Would you dare climb to the top, Gunslinger? Could it be that somewhere above all of endless reality there exists a room you dare not? In the Gunslinger's mind, those words echoed, you dare not. So, you can see like there that it's the center, it kind of holds everything together. And in Christianity, especially when you get into metaphysics, especially like Eastern Orthodox metaphysics, when you look at things like St. Maximus the Confessor, you know, his ideal, the symbols, right, that Christ holds everything together. And that Christ is linked to the Grail and the Grail is linked to Christ, all right? And so we have the quest for the Grail is ultimately a quest for God. Now, I don't know what it is in Stephen King's Dark Tower, because I've only read the first book, but the link between the Grail and the Tower, it's there, specifically mentioned, like I said, on page 84. And then Roland is questing for the Tower, just like Parzival or Galahad are questing for the Holy Grail. And in fact, there's a link between Roland and kind of like the Knights of the Round Table. In a lot of ways, he is a knight. He's like a knight errant. Okay, he's on a quest. And he's up against the man in black, who is a wizard. Okay, and uses magic. The thing that's where we're going to get into now, I want to just discuss a bit about the Wasteland. So in the Wasteland, if you're looking at the Grail legend, okay, what happens is that the Fisher King, now the Fisher King is a figure in Arthurian legend that is wounded by a spear, usually a spear, in the legs or in the genitals, okay, and that what's called the Dolorous Stroke in later Arthurian tales, specifically when you're looking at something like La Morte d'Arthur, where Balin strikes King Peleus. Peleus, in this version, Peleus is the Fisher King. The spear of Longinus pierces Peleus, and then it causes all the land to be laid waste. Turns into a wasteland. So there's this whole idea of the king and the land being one. All right, and it has a lot to do with ritual, and that in a lot of these Arthurian tales, you know, it's like there's a procession. There's a liturgical procession in the Grail Castle. So liturgy, like liturgical rites, are really important for the Grail. And in fact, for the knights, it's living a chaste lifestyle, it's being pious, it's confessing your sins, it's asceticism. okay? But the whole idea of everything falling into waste, now what does the wasteland represent? It represents chaos and disorder. So like I said, if you look at that table, the round table, the grail sits at the center of the table. The grail is the center of the universe, just as Christ holds and binds everything together. So we have this dark tower, which is kind of performing the same function. And the fact that it says that perhaps a deity lives in the tower, lives in the top of it, you can kind of see a parallel there. And the fact that Roland is questing for this tower. Now, we've already had what you would call the Dolorous Stroke, because all the land is already fallen into waste. We start with the wasteland. We don't have the event here that created the wasteland. We're living in the aftermath of it. And perhaps that's revealed in further books. But we do know that just like the quest for the Holy Grail is what caused the Round Table to fall apart, that Roland here is the last of his class of knights. In fact, he's like a knight errant, but instead of swords, uses guns. So this is a fantasy realm. But what we're seeing is that it's become such a wasteland and so chaotic that the borders between realities have even broken down, and that the universes are actually spilling in on each other. Because we have a character named Jake, who the Gunslinger encounters, who is from our world. He's from New York City, and he doesn't really know how he ended up in Roland's world, but Roland's world is dying. In fact, time is all out of whack. Everything's in disorder. You have mutants, roaming around. You have demons, these creatures. You even have like a talking raven named Zoltan. So everything is just very bizarre, right? So it's this breakdown of order. It's a realm of chaos, and everything is disintegrating from being into non-being, essentially. All right, and that's where the parallels between the Arthurian literature and the Tower are kind of like, they map onto each other. But now I want to talk about the inversion of symbols. And the thing that Stephen King does here is that he takes the knight, or the idea of a knight, right, and he turns it upside down. Because if you've read any of those Arthurian legends, only a knight who is pure, who is pious, who is chivalrous, who, is living a life of asceticism and repentance, can obtain the Grail. And Roland is none of that. In fact, being chaste is a big deal in these Arthurian tales. Chastity. Roland is not chaste. He's a sex machine. He's promiscuous, and at one point he even engages in a sex act with a succubus, which is like unconscionable. So the knights, all these Arthurian tales come from, the Latin church, their Western tradition, but they do come from a Christian ethos. In fact, even Sir Gawain, right, and the Green Knight, he has on the inside of his shield, all right, he has an image of the Theotokos, the mother of God. Roland seems to despise asceticism, and I think there was even a page, I don't know what page it was on. It was hold on, I'll see if I can find it. All right, so here it is. It's on page 158 in this copy. He says, in his voice was all the unconscious distaste of the ascetic and the eremite. This is Roland. So he despises asceticism, prayer, fasting, living an ascetical lifestyle. So he's the opposite of the knights that you would find in Arthurian literature. And in fact, there's absolutely, whereas these are Christian, okay, have a Christian ethos, Roland is a pagan. So we're inverting this Arthurian, the Arthurian mythos is being inverted. Because at one point, Roland, he goes to like a Stonehenge type monument where there's a stone altar. he takes mescaline, so he's getting high, and so he can have like a encounter with a succubus who gives him a prophecy, right? Who prophesies to him, and the payment is that he has to engage in the sex act with this, demonic entity. Okay? So that is something that would just be like unconscionable in Arthurian legend. Furthermore, the knight's responsibility, for instance, in the Arthurian tales involving Parzival, okay, you would have his mentor Gurnemont, the man that taught him knightly deeds and how to be a knight, would instruct him in the ways of chivalry and tell him how to be a knight, how to carry yourself, offer mercy, and to protect priests, protect women. In this, he's not trying to protect a priest. He's actually trying to kill a priest. He's pursuing the man in black, and the man in black is actually described as wearing a cassock. Now, a cassock is the traditional garb of Eastern Orthodox clergy. And in fact, all of the Christian symbols in this book have been inverted into being something bad. So all of for instance, in the town of Tull, there is a church there. It looks like a Protestant church, but it's clearly not Christian. It might be using Christian names and whatnot and using Christian hymns, but it's actually a cult that serves the man in black. And Roland here is identified by this congregation as an Antichrist figure, which I'm going to say he actually is. I don't think there are any good characters in this book. Well, Jake. I would say Jake is a good character. Jake may be the only moral character in the entire book, and that's just because he doesn't do anything wrong. But, the whole idea of protecting the innocent, protecting women and children, Roland does the opposite. He slaughters the entire town of Tull, men, women, and children. And whereas a knight is virtuous and just and believes in truth, Roland is actually deceitful. He lies. And it's another spoiler. At the end of the book, he actually allows Jake to die rather than save his life. So you can see that the whole idea of a knight, which Roland is, he's, Roland Duchesne, knight of Gilead, right? Of Gilead, which is kind of like a stand-in for Camelot. But the ties go even deeper. There's even talk in this at one point of an Arthur Eld, which seems to be a one-to-one, a mapping of King Arthur. At least Arthur exists in this other realm. So you think about the fairy realm in Arthurian literature where, Avalon exists. It's like an alternate plane of reality, kind of like the fairy world. So Arthur at least seems to exist in Roland's universe, and he in fact has blood of the, whatever you want to call it, the Arthurian bloodline, I guess. I don't know how he's related, but he's got eld, the blood of the eld or whatever, in his veins. So there is a weird Arthurian connection, but it's, like I said, all the Arthurian mythos has been inverted. All the Christian symbols have been inverted. Even acts, like, for instance, the man in black, which is the evil man, right? The bad guy, the wizard. He resurrects a man from the dead, which is something that Christ does in the New Testament. The resurrection of Lazarus. The resurrection of the man that died in Nain, the resurrection of the little girl, where Jesus goes in and resurrects the girl that dies. So we have this evil character performing an act of resurrection. We have this evil character, the man in black, saying, "Let there be light," and there's light. So there's all this inversion of Christian symbols, and it's very bizarre and kind of Gnostic. It almost seems like, and I'm not there yet, but I wouldn't put it past Stephen King of getting into Gnostic, Christian Gnosticism is what I'm saying. Things like Manichaeism and whatnot, because it seems to be like there's an emanation. The whole idea of emanation And there was even a reference, and I should have wrote it down in here, concerning, emanation. Like, it's kind of like a Platonic idea. And this is one of the things that I find in Stephen King's literature, is that it's very, Gnostic in its beliefs. In fact, even Jesus in this book, Jesus is referred to, but it's just Jesus is called the man Jesus. So it's like he's divested of his divinity. Like he's just some guy, like he's the Jesus of the Doobie Brothers or something. Like Jesus is just all right with me, like not the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So those are just some of the things I noticed. And it's this whole inversion of Christian symbols, the whole inversion of the Arthurian mythos, and we'll see how this progresses. Now, the writing in this, I thought that the writing was fairly good compared to the past 2 Stephen King books I've read. I would say this is better than better than Firestarter and Cujo. I don't know where I'd rank this in my Stephen King ranking of books, but I didn't hate it. There was things in it that I was just found interesting, because I'm picking up on this in Arthurian stuff, but I'm seeing Stephen King invert everything. So everything that is good, concerning the knights, is kind of despised by Roland. And I'm like going, how does one attain the Grail and, the tower, and does it even matter? Like, it's clear to me that the whole idea of religious liturgical rites and everything are unimportant to Roland, that he's actually a pagan, not a Christian, but a pagan. He carries around a jawbone with him, and this kind of ties into the whole Christian idea of relics, like a reliquary and whatnot, but it's clearly not a Christian relic, it's a pagan relic. And doing pagan rituals, it's very bizarre. So Stephen King continues to subvert and invert Christian symbols throughout his work. So we'll see what I have to say about the rest of these books. This is just something I want to touch on and talk about because I picked up on it. And Stephen King's a weird dude, man. I mean, he's just weird. I'm not going to go so far as to say that called the satanic panic of the 1980s down or anything, because I lived through that and I saw how crazy people got. But it is something to be aware of, is that he is actually doing the inversion of symbols. And I really don't like it. It's like a postmodern thing, and, it's really Crowleyan. It's like the whole, Charles Manson theology type stuff. Yeah. All right. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.